Sheriff Nolan Grant had just kicked back in his worn-out armchair, a steaming mug of coffee cradled in one hand and the remote in the other, when a loud banging on his front door shattered the quiet. He wasn't expecting any company, especially not someone knocking like they were trying to bust the door down. With a resigned sigh, he set his mug aside and made his way to the door. What he saw when he opened it nearly had him laughing out loud. 3 men in mismatched, outdated uniforms stood on his porch, puffing their chests like they were gearing up for a raid. The tallest among them, a middle-aged guy with a bushy mustache and reflective sunglasses, stepped forward and flashed a badge that looked more like a cheap novelty item than anything official. "Sir," the mustached man said in an overly deep voice that could have been pulled from an action movie, "we need you to step outside now." Nolan raised an eyebrow and crossed his arms. "And who exactly are you supposed to be?" "We're with the City Enforcement Bureau," the man replied, his 2 companions nodding behind him like they were in some sort of synchronized routine. "You violated multiple neighborhood regulations, and we're here to take you in." Nolan stared at them for a long moment, trying to figure out if this was some kind of prank or if these guys were genuinely clueless. "The City Enforcement Bureau? Really?" he asked, playing along. "We're the real deal," the man with the mustache said, lifting his chin. "We don't tolerate non-compliance." Nolan couldn't help but suppress a grin. He'd heard of some weird enforcement agencies, but this was next-level absurd. The man in front of him reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, flipping it open with dramatic flair. "You've been cited for an unapproved mailbox design," he declared with an air of artificial authority. "An unauthorized patio furniture." Nolan blinked, taking a quick glance at the standard black mailbox by the curb. "What's wrong with my mailbox?" "It doesn't meet the city's aesthetic guidelines." One of the lackeys chimed in, his eyes glued to his clipboard as though he was reading from a manual. "And my patio furniture?" Nolan motioned to the 2 simple chairs on his porch, perfectly ordinary and in no way out of place. "It's unapproved," the mustache man muttered, clearly struggling to come up with more details. Nolan tilted his head, doing his best not to laugh. "So let me get this straight. You're arresting me for a mailbox and some chairs?" "This is no joke," the mustache man barked, taking a step closer. "Non-compliance is a serious offense. You're coming with us." "Really?" Nolan said, folding his arms. "And where exactly are you planning to take me?" "To our holding facility," the man said with a smug look. Nolan couldn't hold it in anymore. "You mean the city has a jail for mailboxes and lawn furniture?" He chuckled to himself. The man's face flushed. "It's not a jail. It's a compliance center." Nolan rubbed his jaw, pretending to consider it. "I see." He paused, looking the 3 men up and down. "Well, I'm a bit tied up today, so I'll have to pass on your lovely offer." The mustached man's patience snapped. "That's it," he shouted, stepping forward. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Nolan didn't budge. "And if I don't?" One of the lackeys stepped forward, pulling out a pair of handcuffs that looked like they'd snap under the slightest pressure. "Do it now, or we'll be forced to act." Nolan sighed and shook his head. "Fine." He slowly turned to his side, not reaching for a weapon, but for the radio clipped to his belt. He pressed the button to send out a silent distress signal to his deputies, all while keeping his eyes locked on the so-called officers. The man with the mustache grinned, clearly thinking he had the upper hand. "That's right," he sneered. "You're learning your place." "I know my place," Nolan replied smoothly. Before the lackey could slap the cuffs on him, Nolan made his move. In a fluid motion, he grabbed the man's wrist, twisted it behind his back, and shoved him toward the nearest car. The lackey yelped as his face slammed against the hood. The mustached man staggered back in shock. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Nolan didn't even glance at him as he kept the man pinned. "Just performing a citizen's arrest." The second lackey reached for something on his belt, probably another fake citation or a piece of plastic nonsense, but froze when the sound of sirens filled the air. Within seconds, real police cars skidded to a stop, their lights flashing. The fake officers looked like they had just been caught in the middle of a robbery. Their confident postures crumbled the moment Deputy Claire stepped out of one of the cars, a look of disbelief on her face. She sized up the scene, Nolan still holding one of the officers pinned to the car, the other 2 frozen in place, and raised an eyebrow. You want to tell me what's going on here, boss? Nolan finally let the squirming man go, stepping back and brushing his hands off. These gentlemen were trying to make an unlawful arrest. I thought I'd save them the trouble. Claire whistled low, then turned to the three men. Let's see some IDs. The mustached man tried to regain his composure, straightening his ill-fitting uniform. There's been some kind of misunderstanding. We're authorized enforcement officers, carrying out our duty. Claire gave him a long look, then reached out and snatched the man's shiny badge. She turned it over in her hands, inspecting the poorly engraved letters that read City Compliance Officer. She glanced back at Nolan. This a joke. I wish, Nolan said with a smirk. The mustache man puffed out his chest again. We have full legal authority to issue citations and enforce community standards. Claire remained unimpressed. Oh, really? Which department issued these badges? The man faltered. The City Homeowners Association, Security Division. Claire snorted. That's not a thing. The second lackey, still nursing his sore wrist, jumped in. It is. We were given jurisdiction over all properties in this area. Jurisdiction, huh? Claire said, turning to Nolan. Boss, did you sign off on that? Nolan smiled. No. Claire gave the mustached man a long, considering look. Guess you're just some guys playing dress-up. The man's face reddened with rage. You don't get it. We're just enforcing compliance. We have the right to detain anyone breaking the rules. Nolan stepped closer. Detain? You were trying to arrest me over a mailbox. The man faltered, realizing just how absurd it sounded. Well, technically, Nolan's voice dropped to a cold, steely tone. There's no technically about it. You tried to arrest me. That's impersonating law enforcement. And depending on how far you're planning to go, we could be talking about unlawful restraint or worse. Claire crossed her arms. Let's start with some real names and some real IDs. The three men hesitated before reluctantly handing over their IDs. Claire flipped through them, then raised an eyebrow. You're going to love this. Not a single one of them is a registered security guard. They don't even have basic certifications. The mustached man scowled, knowing the game was up. As the fake enforcement trio stood there, humiliated and defeated, Nolan couldn't help but feel a mix of amusement and disbelief. The audacity of these wannabe lawmen, pretending to have authority they clearly didn't, was almost impressive in its absurdity. He glanced at Claire, who was busy making a call to have the man escorted away. The moment was a reminder that no matter how high someone thinks they can rise, there's always someone ready to knock them down a peg. Claire turned to him with a smirk. You sure you don't want to start your own enforcement agency, boss? Nolan chuckled. I think I've had enough of fake badges for a lifetime. As the sirens faded and the situation came to a close, Nolan leaned back against the porch railing. It had been a quiet morning until these clowns showed up, and now the calm had returned. But for Nolan, there was always a part of him that enjoyed keeping the peace, whether it was dealing with rogue criminals or rogue bureaucrats. This little debacle might have been ridiculous, but it was a win for common sense, and Nolan would take it. It was just another day in the life of a sheriff, and somehow he wouldn't have it any other way. Nolan glanced at the fake enforcers being loaded into the police car, shaking his head with a small grin. Some people never learn, he muttered. Taking a deep breath, he went back inside. His morning had been far from ordinary, but still under his control. Another peaceful day awaited.